So look here. Imagine this hex ETH pool. There's 12 million hex, 480 ETH. All right, now let's go to say the fork happens. There's 12 million hex there. Now it's technically P hex. And then the Ethereum is now pulse. But obviously this is not a fair amount of pulse in this pool versus this amount of hex, right? Because pulse is 1.2, we'll say it's like 1 million to 1.2 million times more plentiful than Ethereum is. And so in order to make it more fair ratio-wise, because pulse basically becomes the ETH of our system, we need to increase the amount of pulse in these pools by 1.2 million X. Okay. Now, how do you do that in an AMM bot or in an AMM? You can't just multiply it by 1.2 million. That's not how you do it. That would push the price up like way too much. So 1095 times 1095 equals 1.2 million. You can do the math yourself, you'll be surprised. So what happens is you multiply this pulse side by 1095. This is how much pulse is pumped into the pulsex pool, which removes all of the hex here when you're like, well, where'd it go? This is how much it removed because we divide the hex side by 1095. So if you have a starting pool, 1,000 units of something versus 1,000 units of something, you double one side, let's say it's USD, it doesn't really matter what it is. Now there's 2,000. And the way AMMs work is you always have to keep a constant value whenever multiplied together have to equal the same thing. So if you multiply 1,000 times 1,000, it's the same thing as 2,000 times 500. So that's how you know you're doing it correctly, is if you have that same constant product between the two you're changing. So a simple way of figuring out like, okay, how much can we move the price is if you double one side, it 4x's the price of the token on the other side. So how does that math work out? Well, this is a good way of understanding it. If you double the backing of one coin and have the amount of the tokens that are being backed by the double, what you get is basically 2 divided by 1/2. And if you do that math, 2 divided by 1/2 is 4. That's what's happening over here, but on a much larger scale to 1.2 million X instead of 4x over here. So that just gives you this amount of pulse that gets pumped in, and that is able to extract basically 99.9% of the hex, and that is now owned by the bot that we're talking about here that mints this pulse, which is a very small amount of pulse, in order to purchase up 99% of the PRC20. Now that it pushed up the price of hex to this ratio by pouring in, like at 1.2 million X, the price, the virtual price of hex, by pushing in all of this pulse, now this is the new way high price. It's now only 10,000, it's 10,959 hex equals 525,600 pulse. For every 11,000 hex out of its 12 million, it has to mint 525,600 more pulse to match each 11,000 hex. And what you find is, how many times does 10,959 go into 12 million? 1,095. Because the bot can create pulse out of thin air. It just goes, bloop, more pulse created so that we can buy it up and fix the ratios. That's why it's increasing the supply from like 1 to 2.5%. Like it has to have the ability, basically. The bot technically, whenever it owns this stuff, it could make the ratio whatever it wanted and mint any amount of pulse it wanted. It could make the price even higher when it deploys it to pulsex. But we're going to keep the ratios that were already determined by the fair market to be fair whenever we go and deploy it to pulsex. So, because this virtually moves the prices up as if Pulse was ETH in the system, but also accounting for the 1.2 million X in like increased supply. And so that's why we have to increase it so that the amount of Pulse in the pool is fair in valuation. So it's basically acts as the ETH. That is how the automated market maker works. Automated market maker bot. It goes in, purchases up the PRC20 by minting Pulse at first, just a little bit of Pulse, and then it throws it in there. It buys up 99.9% because of how the math works out for the amount that we chose to multiply it by. Like, what multiple do we decide? If we decide to do 1,000,000x, then you would just multiply the starting Pulse by 1,000, and it'd be 1,000,000 times. So currently there's 118 million Ethereum total supply, and then there's 133 projected trillion supply and for Pulse. So if we divide that by 118 million, we actually get a number that's not 1.2 million times. It's 1.12. It's like 1.1 million. So the math all still checks out. It's just that we may use either 1,000,000x to 1.2 million x. But that's where that 1 point whatever million x you want to use to extract the PRC20s comes from. It's just deciding on how high do you want to push the prices of these things to make it as accurate as possible to the prices according to Ethereum AMMs.